Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. I'm Randy Wright, and I'll be your captain on this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. Folks, this will be the final boarding call, so if you please, claim your seats, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show while I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, as there really is a lot of news and information to get to before I may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, you've all heard us mention the alternative right or alt-right on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer. And it may seem puzzling that we're going to spend yet another episode focusing on this, but I think it's of the utmost importance, particularly when you consider the drastic impact that they have had on this 2016 presidential election cycle. There can be no question that the bizarre ascendancy of the New York billionaire, businessman, real estate tycoon, and all-around vulgarian, Donald J. Trump, can be traced in some ways to the support that he has received from the so-called alternative right or alt-right. Now, it's not a term that has cropped up in previous elections, at least not to the point of where it is a point of major discussion, as it has been in this 2016 presidential election cycle. Nevertheless, it is a movement that has a rather varied history, and it has been in existence, at least in the connotation of the quote-unquote eclectic groupings of philosophies and thoughts in the United States for at least 5 to 6 years now. But, you know, it remains a rather elusive term still. And the question that lingers is whether it's going to have a detrimental impact on the 2016 presidential election cycle, but also, and more importantly, on the conservative movement in general. So let's actually delve a little bit into what the alt-right is, how it got its start, and why we should even care about it. I know that we've said that it's already basically tied its fate or attempted to project its own identity as a political movement, philosophy, and ideology to the bizarre ascendancy of the New York billionaire, businessman, real estate tycoon, and all-around vulgarian, Donald J. Trump. But there's more to it than just Trump. Trump alone is not the driving force of the alt-right. The alt-right just saw this as a mechanism through which to spread its influence upon American culture and the American system of polity in general. So to delve a little bit into the history of it, we see that the term alt-right is somewhat amorphous. Its origins date back to people like Oswald Spengler, H.L. Mencken, Julius Evola, and Sam Thomas Francis. So let's start with Oswald Spengler. Spengler was born in 1880 in Germany and died in 1936. He was a German historian and philosopher of history. He published a book known as The Decline of the West at the end of World War I, and during the interwar period, he became an enthusiastic supporter of German nationalism. In fact, it was so much of a supporter of it, or he was so much a supporter of it, that Joseph Goebbels had claimed that Spengler was an intellectual precursor to the Nazi-fueled Aryan supremacy doctrine and ideology. In other words, what Spengler was trying to do was preach of German superiority in the interwar periods. And that makes sense to a certain degree when you consider what was going on with the German psyche at the time. The Germans were utterly humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles that was held in the Palace of Versailles at the Hall of Mirrors, which in and of itself had symbolic meaning that I'll delve into here in a second, but they didn't like the terms of the treaty. And in all fairness, the treaty was overzealous. It was essentially the Allied powers attempting to seek retribution against the centralized powers of World War I. And the idea of holding it in the palace or in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles had some deeply rooted historical significance and meaning. After all, that's where Kaiser Wilhelm I, after the Franco-Prussian War of the 1870s, had crowned himself king of a new unified German empire, or German Reich. And that was done after Napoleon III had been captured, and essentially all of France was left at the mercy of this new rising German state that had just broken off under the tutelage of Otto von Bismarck from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So it was a slap at German nationalism. And German nationalism at that time was at a fervor because Germany was a relatively new state. Now, that's not to say that the German principalities hadn't existed for generations and centuries, because if you think about the Anglo-Saxon tribes, they were Germanic tribes. German was a language, but they had essentially been part of the Habsburg Empire, part of that old Holy Roman Empire that was the Carolingian type dynasty that had arisen in the aftermath of the fall of Rome. But it hadn't been a unified state. It was several different principalities that were now being brought under one centralized national identity. And that was only done in the late 19th century. So by 1918, Germany was still a very young nation. And so the Treaty of Versailles was used and utilized by people like Oswald Spengler to point out that German nationalism was being threatened, belittled, benign, and abridged by the, as they put it, arrogant, victorious Allied powers. Now, to be fair with respect to the Nazi proclamation that Spengler was their intellectual precursor, basically the progenitor of their line of thought, they did criticize him in 1933, but it wasn't based on any philosophical differences or goals in ideology, but rather a sense of defeatism that was being expressed by Spengler. And so he was basically not very optimistic about Germany's future, even though by 1933 the Third Reich was in its conception, essentially, for lack of a better term. So we see that that was one of the pillars of alt-right thinking. The second is Henry Louis Mencken, or H.L. Mencken, who was an American journalist born in 1880 and died in 1956. He was a wordsmith who coined the term monkey trial for the Scopes trial, which, if you recall, was that Tennessee case dealing with Tennessee's law on creationism, and evolution was being fought by Roger Nash Baldwin's ACLU, which used Clarence Darrow as their attorney, and he was facing against William Jennings Bryan, who was a populist and had delivered the famous 1896 Cross of Gold speech and had essentially conducted a hostile takeover of the Democrat Party, much like what we see with the mafioso quafioso and the gutless opposition party in this ill-fated 2016 presidential election cycle. But we see that he himself had a different point of view, different perspective from many in the country. And one of the things he was an ardent admirer of Nietzsche, that German philosopher that had an inherent distrust of religion. He himself was a detractor of religion. He was ironically also a detractor of populism, but at that time, populism did have a religious fervor with it. Williams Jennings Bryan was defending creationism. He was an ardent religious pastor type, and this to Mencken was unacceptable. But on top of this, he was opposed to representative government. His argument against representative governments like that of the United States is that he believed it was a system in which inferior men dominated their superiors. So there we're starting to see the common thread that unites alternative right or alt-right thinking. They believe in a type of tribalism that I'm not going to go so far as to say that all of them are racist, because again, as I mentioned at the outset of today's Solo Flight Special Edition of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, it's an amorphous term. It's kind of a big tent term. But there is this idea of trying to engage in identity politics. Now, as we have oftentimes reiterated on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, this type of balkanization is a tried and true tactic and strategy of the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists who are diametrically opposed to the United States Constitution and the United States system of polity and the freedoms enjoyed and exercised by the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, we the people. And so it shows that it could be construed as a symptom of a greater illness that ails the United States of America. And it's something that we need to pay some particular attention to. As Jeremy Grapington has said, my first officer, he said that without our rights, we have nothing. But for the alternative right, they don't view the rights as being rooted in natural law because of these two pillars and these foundational philosophers of whom the alternative right gathers their inspiration and draws inspiration from. We see that there is this thread of distrusting this notion of spiritualism or this idea of natural law tenets and your basic Enlightenment era thinking. They thought it was archaic. They thought it was out of place in a modern society. And so that's a strain of thought that they share with the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists. And it means that they are ultimately diametrically opposed to the natural law tenets that underpin not only our shared United States Constitution, but also our representative Republican form of government. So that now brings me to the third philosophical underpinning and progenitor of the alt-right movement, Julius Evola. Now, he was an Italian philosopher born in the late 1800s. He was also a painter and an esotericist, which is essentially seeking a super rationality, a super form of rationality beyond regular human capacity for thought and reason. It's a bit like a New Age form of Stoicism. Now, he was an aristocratic reactionary. His own personal philosophy was that the world was marred and mired by a dark age of unleashed materialism, lack of proper spiritualism, and disillusion. Interestingly, he had never joined the National Fascist Party of Mussolini. Nonetheless, Mussolini considered Evola an hysterical fanatic whom he could use to advance the fascist cause. Also of note here is his work known as the Synthesis of the Doctrine of Race, which Mussolini had praised as a uniquely Roman form of fascist racism, distinct and apart from that found in Nazi Germany. So again, we see that there is this type of tribalism playing into it and a type of racial ideology that plays into it. And while that's not what I think fully defines the alternate right, it's certainly something that the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media are going to latch onto as an avenue of attack, something that they can use to perpetuate their twisted ideology that is rooted in balkanization and this somewhat innocuously named identity politics. Again, as the great visionary Zygmunt Dobbs had demonstrated in his magnus opus of Keynes at Harvard, this is what they engage in. It's to pit American citizen against American citizen to ultimately and incrementally dovetail their twisted ideology and their anti-constitutional ideology into place within the upper echelons of polite society. And so we see that the alt-right falls victim to this as well, based on their underpinnings. And so the salivating mainstream media is going to be able to try and make propagandistic hay out of this because it plays into the narrative that they've been pushing for so long. And so that brings us now to the next pillar of the alt-right formation, and that's Samuel Todd Francis, who was born in 1947 and died in 2005, an American so-called paleoconservative, an iconoclastic anti-capitalist columnist. So again, I struggle with calling him any type of conservatism or conservative, because how can you be conservative when you seek to destroy the capitalist free market system that has been a quintessential pillar of United States history for our entire existence as a nation? But we see that he was a reactionary who inherently distrusted free market systems, and that puts him at odds with the vision that our founding fathers had dreamed up for this nation since its inception some 235 years ago. And so we see that there is this common strain. It's a new age form of populism rooted in trying to dismantle the time-honored traditions, institutions, and core principles and values of these United States of America and replace it with some other ideology. Now, the term itself, as well as its media existence, can be pinned to one man, Richard Spencer. Spencer was an editor at Talkies magazine. Now, he left the magazine in 2010, about 6 years ago, to create AlternativeRight.com. Now, that became the epicenter of alt-right thinking. The movement received a lot of its nihilistic edge, however, from a popular site that predated this, known as 4chan, and that has long been a hotbed of what I am deeming as neo-countercultural thinking. And so what we see here is kind of a strange dichotomy. We had the counterculture of the 1960s that sought to tear society asunder, that sought to push the Fabian socialist agenda, and what a lot of these up-and-coming alt-right types are finding is that they're disillusioned with that system, that the promises that were made by that system aren't real, and they see that system as being an impediment for their own personal growth and advancement and achievement. And they're not entirely incorrect in thinking that, because the counterculture of the 1960s that led to a great many of the problems that we currently face in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours has major problems. It has engaged in that tried, true, and albeit threadbare tactic and strategy of divide and conquer. That has always been the modus operandi of the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists. But the alt-right are not going via the one avenue that really did propel this nation to such lofty heights in our relatively brief yet illustrious history throughout the course of human events. And that speaks to a greater problem. It speaks to a problem that we have addressed on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, namely that the historical revisionists have been working in tandem with the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media and the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist controlled Democrat Party to annihilate the national character, heritage, spirit, and above all, identity of the United States. So these people see the balkanization, the identity politics, the politics of division, for lack of a better term, being implemented by these frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists, and they see the system as being intrinsically opposed to them and systemically opposed to them. And in a way, they're right, the way that the system's been perverted. But if we were to go back to the natural law tenets and to strict adherence to the clear and concise language contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution at all levels of government, this sort of problem wouldn't exist. It wouldn't be something that we would have to necessarily concern ourselves with. And I don't think that they would find themselves feeling so disenfranchised and alienated by the American system of polity. Again, this goes back to the line that Roger Nash Baldwin, the creator or one of the co-founders of the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, said when he said that we have to use the Constitution to destroy the Constitution. Well, the rise of the alt-right can be at least loosely attributed to that. It certainly was allowed to foster as a direct consequence and result from that line of thinking that Roger Nash Baldwin had basically pushed to the forefront of American philosophy and polity. But again, it does not trace its roots to the natural law tenets. It is not based on the core philosophy of the United States. And I know that I've mentioned that quote from Maggie Thatcher before, but it bears repeating here because it will help delineate some of the stark differences between the alt-right, which is not rooted in anything that is traditionally what one might refer to as Americana, from Europe. And what Maggie said was that the United States of America was founded upon philosophy, whereas Europe was founded upon history. And really, that philosophy to which she was speaking is the Enlightenment era inspired natural law tenets that form an integral part of who we are, both as a nation and as a people. It's not something that can easily be ignored, and it's something that the Fabian socialists have been fighting for well over a century and a half now. And so the way that they have infiltrated, they being the Fabian socialists in the guise of historical revisionists and pushing for things like Common Core, our institutions of education, our ivory tower of academia from coast to coast and border to border, they have essentially created a vacuum with the up-and-coming generations because they're not being taught their history anymore. These up-and-coming generations don't realize just what a magnificent thing our representative Republican form of government is. They don't realize that our Constitution is the longest contiguous or uninterrupted running constitutional document in the entire course of human events. Rather, they know that they feel ostracized and alienated and disillusioned by the identity politics and balkanization that are key components of the Fabian socialist agenda, which inherently, by going on racial theory, one of those critical theories that is based on Marxism and nihilism, have been made the enemy. They view themselves as being unjustly vilified. And they're right in thinking that. I mean, I experienced that sort of thing when I was in college, too. But it's important that we stay focused on the natural law tenets and the foundational roots of the United States of America, because our founding fathers had intended for that to last for posterity. And of course, we, in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours, carry the onus of responsibility to proactively maintain and safeguard our fundamental and inalienable God-given rights. And that's one of the quintessential aspects of understanding how the United States system of polity is based on self-accountability, self-responsibility, and those two elements working in conjunction, providing us with self-determination. Therefore, to enjoy and exercise our fundamental and inalienable rights, which were endowed to us by our Creator, the God of nature himself, we have to realize that there is always an equal and impactful duty and obligation, as well as a responsibility that couches with it, and that is maintaining those rights. That is ensuring that the government does not become some rogue, tyrannical element that is operating in illegitimate fashion to abridge, encroach upon, and belittle those fundamental rights. Because as George Mason, that founding father who had been called upon to help draft the Declaration of Rights for the state of Virginia, concluded those rights cannot be abridged without due process under the law, meaning that we hold those rights as sacred. It's one of those self-evident truths that Thomas Jefferson so poetically penned in that beautiful language of our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain fundamental and unalienable rights, and that chief among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That right there defines the very noble characteristics that have led and guided America to her lofty place in the nations of the world. And it is a natural law system based on Enlightenment-era philosophy that is by its very nature timeless. But the alt-right, which are mostly young people, don't realize that. That's not what they've been taught. It's not what they've heard. They've heard that, again, the founding fathers were racist, sexist, homophobic, white, slaveholding men. And that's what they think. They think that it really wasn't any exceptional thing. They don't believe that American exceptionalism is part of it, or if they do, it's only for a certain group. They ignore that part of what Jefferson said. All men, meaning humanity. Now, it's not to say equal outcomes, as the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists want to paint it. No, it means that we each are provided equal protection under the law, and that we have equal opportunities to use the talents that we were naturally born with to the best of our abilities. That is the pursuit of happiness, to acquire property, to live up to and fulfill the American dream. But of course, the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists and the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media don't want that to come to fruition. They don't want people to think about that because, again, it's detrimental and deleterious to their twisted, propagandistic Fabian agenda. So we look back at this movement with the alternative right, and with Richard Spencer, who had created that specific website, alternativeright.com, which became the hotbed of where they could congregate and come into existence. But it also has seen isolationists, pro-Russians, and ex-Ron Paul supporters swell its ranks. Yet the largest subsect of it all are the so-called neo-reactionaries. Now, this group refers to itself as the Dark Enlightenment. And I know that I've mentioned this in the previous episode that I did outlining the alternative right, but I want to get into a little more detail with it here. In other words, it adopts an anti-representational government and reactionary philosophy which rejects egalitarianism and natural law. So you see, already those groups are buying into a reactionary movement that traces its origins to the new French right. So European ideologies that are not rooted in traditional American institutions of thought and philosophy. So in America, the neo-reactionaries congregated around a forum known as Less Wrong. Less Wrong had urged its community to think like robots or machines rather than humans. In other words, they were encouraged to dismantle civil discourse and concerns for the well-being of their fellow citizens. They loathe piety and our time-honored traditions and institutions. So again, we see that it is a system that traces an overt hostility to our system of polity, an overt hostility to the values, principles, institutions, and philosophies of these United States of America. And again, it's because of the way that the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists have managed for the past century at least to infest and invade all of our institutions of education. And again, pointing back to Zygmunt Dobbs and his magnus opus at Keynes at Harvard, he was pointing to how they were using the School of Economics and the ideology of Keynesian economics, which is really just a front for Fabianism, to spread this ideology that the American system of polity, the American system of free market economy has failed, and that they can create something better by incrementally pushing the nation leftward, incrementally seeking to fundamentally redefine the United States of America away from being a constitutionally endowed federalist representative republic to some Orwellian, twisted, Fabian socialist dystopia. Now, of course, nothing could be further from the truth, but that's what they want you to believe. It goes back to that Cloward and Piven type mantra, mindset, and philosophy that had dominated the counterculture of the 1960s. And remember that Cloward and Piven was all about overwhelming the system, creating problems, then complaining about the problems within the system, using the system to create the problems, complaining about the problems, having the people come back to the government on their knees to fix the problem, thereby surrendering even more of their precious, fundamental, and inalienable God-given rights. It truly is a nefarious system. It's a system that we should be cognizant of as dangerous, one that is detrimental to all of our hopes, dreams, and aspirations. But the alt-right understands that there's something wrong with this system, understands that this system isn't working and isn't looking out for their best interests, but because they don't have the basis in our representative Republican form of government, our system of polity, our constitutional philosophy, they look for other alternatives. Because in their mind, they believe that the Constitution is impotent, that it's archaic, antiquated, and has no way of advancing their thoughts, their hopes, their dreams, and their aspirations. And it's truly tragic to see that that has become a part of the mantra. Because when you stop and think about it and analyze it, It shows that essentially the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists, who are hell-bent on the utter annihilation of the United States of America, both as a nation and as a people, have essentially robbed the future of this up-and-coming generation. They have gleefully stood at the podiums of the ivory tower of academia and proclaimed that the future is dark for this up-and-coming generation, that their prospects will be worse than their parents. And that's not something to take glee in. That's not something to profess as a beautiful thing, because it's not. It's ugly. It's twisted. But I was exposed to that when I was in college. I had a professor who proclaimed that the individuality of students would disappear, that they would not live up to the standards of their parents, and that's a good thing, because that's helping set a new world standard that's more equal. Now, when you are faced with such radical fanaticism as that in your education, it can lead you to feel disenfranchised, to feel alienated, to feel ostracized. Because in a sense, that's exactly what they're doing. They're wanting to demoralize you with the thought that you're not going to be able to do anything. And if you don't have a deeply rooted, fluent, and working knowledge and understanding of our shared United States Constitution, and thereby your fundamental and inalienable God-given rights, you can easily be misled into concluding that our system of polity and our Constitution has failed, that it is not doing what it was designed to do, and therefore we need something more robust, more reactionary. And that's a lot of what the alt-right is. It's reactionary. But it's certainly not what I would consider conservative, because conservatism, by its root, means to conserve the system that exists, to conserve the Constitution, because that is the system. That is what defines us, both as a nation and as a people. And it also outlines and mandates the proper scope and application of our representative republic within the clear and concise language contained within its four corners. But again, they're not taught that. They're not taught the history or the philosophies and thought processes that underpin this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. And that, of course, is by design. That's what the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists have wanted to essentially indoctrinate this up-and-coming generation with. And so they see that as an opportunity, they being the Fabian socialists, as to spread greater chaos and tumult and just turbulence within the societal fabric of these United States of America. And that's what they are working towards. They're working towards fundamentally transforming us, and in a very negative and in a very intellectually disingenuous fashion and manner. But we see that back on March 29th, 2016, Alum Bokhari and Milo Yiannopoulos published a piece on Breitbart, entitled An Establishment Conservative's Guide to the Alt-Right. So already we see that it's dripping with sarcasm, that they're essentially trying to say that anyone who opposes the alternative right are just quote-unquote establishment types. That's a gross simplification on their part. It's a generalization on their part that is not rooted in reality, but it's what they think. And we've seen some of your mainstay conservative punditry and commentatorate, like Lush Bimbo and Michael Weena Savage and Laura Inkampf, as well as Little Orphan Annie Yep Toto Taylor Coulter, the floozy, come out and say that, yeah, anyone who opposes Donald J. Trump is clearly part of the establishment. But poppycock, if you've listened to any of the episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, you know that we are about the furthest thing you can get from the so-called establishment of the Gutless Opposition Party, or GOP. Hell, even my use of that renaming of the acronym of GOP, away from Grand Old Party to Gutless Opposition Party, is rooted in my inherent distaste with the current state of affairs that are occurring within the Republican Party by the detente wing, or what's known in the common vernacular as the so-called establishment leadership of the GOP, ignoring the will of true conservatives, essentially going out and attacking true conservatives. But the difference is, I do not believe that Donald J. Trump is a conservative, and ultimately, I do not believe that the alt-right is conservative either, because they're not seeking to conserve our representative Republican form of government. They're not seeking to preserve our Constitution, and they are not seeking to advocate for the natural law tenets that are inscribed on the hearts of each and every one of us by birth or by naturalization. And so I have a problem with that. I understand the inherent threat that this alt-right system poses, and it's a significant and substantial one that we simply cannot ignore. And if we try to ignore it, basically going along the lines of detente, then we will continue to bear witness to this death spiral afflicting the United States of America not only continue unabated, but accelerate exponentially. And we can ill afford that right now, especially when you consider that the United States of America is in the grips of an identity crisis coupled with a slew of constitutional crises. After all, part of the whole impetus behind this disastrous Barack Hussein Obama regime has been to work his hatred against all that the United States represents in these two terms of his. And he's been very successful with it because he's had the graduates of Pavlov School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media and pop culture and all of these other various and nefarious elements working in tandem with him, essentially refusing to stand up to him, refusing to go back to the time-honored roots and traditions of the United States of America. And again, it's all because they have this twisted idea that somehow socialism, which would be theft by any other name, would be a good thing. But as the great French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville, who was an ardent admirer of fledgling America, stated that anyone who supports any flavor, facet, or form of socialism is actually a New Age feudalist, because they seek to micromanage the facets of our daily lives to control us from cradle to grave, while carving out a special niche for themselves. Again, going after the natural law tenets, the same type of approach that we're seeing as a common denominator within these various schools of thought and philosophy that make up the alternative right or alt-right. And so, again, it's not something that can be easily ignored, but it is something that can be skewed, purposefully skewed in a direction that it was never meant to go by those who are purposefully and intentionally being intellectually disingenuous. And of course, I'm speaking primarily of the graduates of Pavlov School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media, because deep down, what they're trying to do, what their modus operandi is to go by the rules of radicals, which is the Fabian Socialist Bible written by the Fabian Socialist deviant Saul Alinsky, of capturing a target, polarizing that target, personifying that target, and applying all of your own negative attributes through projection onto that target, so that people begin to just loathe and despise the targeted subject. And the alt-right provides that perfect opportunity of it. So again, it's the left that created the problem. And when the problem arises, it's the left that will opportunize off of that to claim that they can create the solution, which will just double down on the problem. It's intellectually disingenuous, but it is what they engage in, and they are masters of that trade. It's what they have done for successive generations now. And so it's something that needs to be addressed, and the way to address it is, as my first officer, Jeremy Grapington, has said before, to go back to basics. And basics in this country is none other than going back to strict adherence to the clear and concise language contained within our shared United States Constitution, to stand up for and defend those sacred rights that are quintessential defining characteristics of who we are, not only as a nation, but also as a people. So we see that they have gone through with Alum Bukhari and Yiannopoulos, basically praised the groups that I've mentioned and claimed that its critics are just mired by the cancerous doctrine of political correctness. Now, there's another intellectually disingenuous aspect. Of course, what I find interesting is that this article didn't mention moral relativism so much as these groups reject traditional morality. Now, why would I consider that a problem? Well, that's fairly easy. The reason I consider that a problem is if you look back to the writings of our founding fathers, James Madison, John Adams had both said that our republic needs to be a virtuous republic, that the only way for liberty and freedom to flourish is for the electorate, the body of popular sovereigns, to be armed with the knowledge of their system, the knowledge of their rights, and to stay abreast of political developments, and to be exceedingly proactive in our system of polity. And it makes sense that that is what they said, and that, again, just gives even more credence to what Zygmunt Dobbs said when he claimed that essentially the Fabian socialists were working to not only divide and conquer the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, but also to overzealously regulate them so that they could not actively participate within the system of polity, that they would be so mired with just mere sustenance, trying to survive, trying to maintain their quality of life, their standard of living against all odds. And of course, the Fabian socialist agenda and system is to make it so draconian with their regulations and whatnot that they implement this system of paranoia and pessimism so that the ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty ultimately lose faith in their system of polity and surrender their rights, all in the name of being saved. And that's where that danger of the messianic figure, one who claims to have the ability to save the nation, to do whatever is necessary in his or her capacity and his or her capacity alone, is truly such a reckless and dangerous thing, because it ultimately threatens to snuff out our time-honored traditions and institutions. Now, we can't afford that. We simply cannot afford to allow our system of polity, which is the longest contiguous or uninterrupted running one in all of world history, to fade. Because if we allow it to fade, then we are giving in to the twisted machinations of these frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists who are trying to force a failed ideology, philosophy, and political system down our throats. And they operate from this erroneous notion that it's just the wrong people have attempted to implement it. It's not the right people. If only intelligent people like themselves had been there to implement it in the first place, then we wouldn't have the problems. Of course, that's a load of bovine excrement, but that's what they believe. That is literally what they focus their modus operandi upon. but it has no place in an open and honest and ultimately free society like that of the United States of America. But they don't care. They're going to continue to double down on these efforts. But going back to that article in Trump Bart, we see that one ironic aspect of this article is they labeled this group as a sort of natural conservatism, that it was fighting for a white culture alone. Now, that's not natural conservatism. That's white nationalism. And of course, they try and poo-poo anyone saying that. But again, in the United States of America, the only thing that we are called to swear loyalty and allegiance to is the Constitution. And it's within the clear and concise language of the Constitution that we find the definition of America as a nation. So white nationalism is diametrically opposed to constitutional compositionism. And again, I think that's why we need to focus on utilizing and developing that term, because if you go back to the original composition of the Constitution, you see what the true natural law tenets are. It is not something that can be perverted, like the terms conservative or alternative right can be. And of course, that goes back to a common thread that we've had here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, going back to our premiere episode, which aired on September 11th of 2015, which is to say that this dark and twisted game of semantics is being utilized in such a way as to strip and deprive us of all that we hold near and dear in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. It's just one of those things that you can't ignore or avoid, because it is quintessentially part of the narrative that these people have illicitly, unreasonably, and wickedly foist upon the body politique of these United States of America. And it's troubling. It truly is troubling to see that that aspect is gaining traction, is becoming something that we need to be concerned with here in the United States of America. But of course, there's more to it than just that. And so we need to basically take a look at what's going on. The problem with this idea that they are fighting for a white culture is that it plays directly into the divisive identity politics and balkanization which is championed by the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists. In other words, this ideology cannot truly be defined as conservative, as I just mentioned. Indeed, it falls into the question that J.D. Rucker, the owner of the New Americana, posed in his recent article, which stated that republicanism isn't conservatism. And at the root of that article, he asked whether we should adopt a new term. Because clearly, as he mentioned throughout the scope of that article, conservatism has not been well defined in the United States. And in fact, I think what we need to do is basically look at the definition of conservative again to get a more deeply rooted and fuller understanding of what's wrong. Conservative as an adjective is defined as holding to traditional attributes and values and cautious about change or innovation, typically in relation to politics or religion. It can also be called dyed-in-the-wool, hidebound, unadventurous. You see, there's a negative connotation with it. But as a noun, it's a person who is averse to change and holds to traditional values and attitudes, typically in religion and politics. Now, it's not just being adverse to change. We're not opposed to change. After all, Article 5 of the Constitution says that you can change the Constitution, but through a set process. And so it's not even so much that we're adverse to change. We're adverse to change for change's sake, or change to a system that has no basis in reality that has no proven track record other than a track record of failure. It'd be one thing if it was based on freedom and natural law tenets, as our founding fathers had based their core principles and philosophies upon. And that was known as classical liberalism. And so, again, that brings us back to this game of semantics where the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists have been able to pervert and irreparably redefine terms, gay being one and liberal being the other. Gay used to mean happy, but that's not what it means anymore. You can't use it in its classical connotation. It has been forever marred by this hijacking through semantics. And it really is important to give words their original meaning. Law is based on that entirely. Terms of art are dangerous, but they are also part of law. And so what the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftist and indeed the alternative right are doing is they are trying to create new terms of art, going in and instantaneously changing the meaning of words, such as conservative in the case of the alt-right, to be things that they were never originally intended to be. And again, going back to the point that Zygmunt Dobbs made in Keynes at Harvard, it's that they engage in this type of fluffery and puffery to essentially pull the political wool over the eyes of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in order to convince them that this system of what they're doing is not bad, that it is some benign thing. But it's not benign. It's malignant. It's destructive. It's ugly. And it's hateful. But not hateful so much fully in the sense as the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media are trying to paint it as. No, it doesn't fit into that narrow definition and dichotomy, as they put it. It's more of a disconnect from our traditions and our institutions. And so how can they be conserving something? Maybe they're conserving the quote-unquote white culture, but in the United States, we don't have a race-based culture. That was the very idea behind the notion of equal protection under the law. Now, yes, the historical revisionists will sit there and say, well, that can't be true because slavery existed, blah, 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 blah. Well, no. If a person were to procure their freedom, if a black man or woman was to procure their freedom, then they were to be treated equal under the law. Segregation didn't rise until the aftermath of the American Civil War. And it was pushed primarily up in the North, because yes, there was segregation up north too, by Irish immigrants who thought that their position was being challenged by former slaves that were heading north and would compete with them directly for low-skill labor and low-wage labor. And so we see that, again, if you look at the original intent of the Founding Fathers, they didn't want slavery to be in. If you recall, George Mason was opposed to it. Thomas Jefferson wanted to get rid of it. Oh, well, he had slaves, and Sally Heming, he freed them. George Washington freed his. You see, that, again, they try to apply modern social mores to that time. But what you see is the aspects of their philosophy that are rooted in the natural law are timeless. Yes, they said it was like holding a tiger by its mouth. You dare not let go because it will consume you. But the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists have used this as a way to promote balkanization, to push the the twin cancerous doctrines of political correctness and moral relativism to pit American citizen against American citizen in this intellectually disingenuous pursuit of redefining the United States of America fundamentally, permanently, and irreparably. And so we have to be cognizant of that. And of course, again, as I've mentioned from the outset of today's program, the alt-right is a reactionary movement to the wide-eyed success that the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists have had over this past century and a half. And so we come back now to a lot of what the problem is. These groups, these alt-right groups, are employing the same tactics as the Fabian socialists. They are attempting to engage in a game of semantics with the goal of permanently redefining conservatism to fit their supposed New Age philosophy. And I kind of throw that qualifier in, supposed, because this isn't really a New Age philosophy. It's something we've encountered before. Because the truth be told, it is a bunch of European thought that gained favor in the waves of fascism that fell over Germany, Spain, and Italy in the 1930s, directly leading to the outbreak of the Second World War. So by its very nature, these reactionary systems are dangerous. They're dangerous because they ultimately seek to destabilize the system of polity. They are based in populism, which is in and of itself destructive. And I think it's important that we also look at the definition of populism, just as a refresher of why it's not necessarily a good thing. At its root, populism is a belief in the power of quote-unquote regular people and in their right to have control over their government rather than a small group of political insiders. On the surface, that's benign. But it said also that it's about overthrowing the government and redefining it in a way that is more spread with wealth and more bent towards a new type of system. But it in and of itself is not a philosophy. And again, it is a term of art. There we go, right back to the game of semantics. It's a term of art that has been redefined as a way to push for progressivism, as a way to push for ideologies and philosophies and belief systems that are not in any way, shape, or form related to the true historical and traditional institutions and natural law tenets of this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. And so there really is this dangerous aspect to it, this dangerous aspect of it that threatens to destabilize even further the American system of polity and leave us in this dangerous and untenable situation. And we must be wary of that. So why am I mentioning the alt-right again? Well, it's because the 2016 election cycle has been marred by upheavals within the Republican Party. The détente wing of the gutless opposition party, or GOP, the so-called establishment, ignored true constitutionalists, and the alt-right saw this as an opportunity to gain a hegemonic position in American society, and particularly in the Republican Party. And again, that plays directly into the hands of the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists that want to be able to point in egotistical arrogance and say, see, looky, we told you they be racist. But what does that gain for us? What does it gain for the nation? Nothing. All of these ideologies are diametrically opposed to who we are as a nation and as a people, to what we hold dear. Now, we can't just allow that to continue unfettered. We cannot just allow that to go forth ignored, as the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media has been ignoring it, as the historical revisionists and the proponents of Common Core education ignore it. No, this is a glaring, clear, and present danger and threat to all that we hold near and dear in this country. And it is a direct threat to our way of life, to our culture. Because these things are not rooted in our culture. These things are not rooted in the time-honored traditions and values of these United States of America. They are foreign and alien to it. And they are also diametrically opposed to it. And we can't allow that to just come to fruition. We can't allow that to be the way that the system continues. Because ultimately it's going to tear us apart. It is going to lead us down that dark path to totalitarianism, irrespective of whether it's under the tutelage of a President Hillary Clinton or the tutelage of a President Smalley Hands Donald of Trumpus. Either one of them would essentially give fuel to the fire. And this fire is threatening to consume us, is threatening to destroy our traditions, our institutions, our very way of life, and indeed our sovereignty. And we cannot allow that to be the case. We must be stalwart in the defense of our fundamental and inalienable God-given rights, because nobody else will do it. Nobody else is endowed with the authority or the wherewithal to do that. And so, again, they latched on to the bizarre ascendancy of Donald J. Trump, they being the alt-right, as an opportunity to conduct a hostile takeover of the Republican Party in general and the conservative movement in particular. And once again, that's basically opening up the proverbial Pandora's box for the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism, for the salivating mainstream media, their Fabian socialist allies, and the historical revisionists. Because, again, it's a way to fulfill their dark and twisted machinations, to point to it and say, looky, 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 we were right all along. So we can sit there and continue to marginalize those who disagree with us and paint them as racist. And now it will be more difficult than ever to shed that view. And Yiannopoulos and that other twerp at Breitbart, forget the other guy's name, Bokhari, I believe it was, said that it's idiotic to say that that's part of it, that the racist aspect is there. But no, it's not. And that conservatives are just afraid of being labeled that. It's not that we're being afraid of being labeled that. Fear has nothing to do with it. It's the fact of what the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists can do with those kinds of labels. That comes straight out of the tenets of propaganda by Joseph Goebbels, and you would certainly think that the alt-right would understand that. They implement it in their own tactics and strategies. But again, it's their intellectually disingenuous way of labeling, which rests at the core of this propagandistic agenda and goal that they've been pushing. And it has no place in a free, open, honest, and above all, liberty-loving society like that of the United States of America. So we have to be aware of it, and we have to be ready to take the steps that are necessary. So to go back to J.D. Rucker's question of whether we should adopt a new term, we should fight to preserve the proper definition of conservatism. But at the same time, we should adopt one which cannot be perverted. that of constitutional compositionists. We are for the way that the Constitution was originally composed. We are for the strict adherence of its clear and concise language, and we will not deviate from that. That is much harder to pervert. And it's as Aristotle said in his Art of Rhetoric, that we are much less willing and less reticent to accept a lie, a falsehood, an untruth, than we are the truth. It is the natural inclination of humanity to believe the truth. And that's a problem that the Fabian socialists face. It's also a problem that the alternative or alt-right faces. And it's because ultimately their ideology, ultimately what they are pushing for, is rooted on a lie. It's based on a lie. It's not based on reality or truth. And that's something they can't get around, except through deception, except through trying to deceive the people. And we can't just allow that to go through, because if we do, then we have abandoned our principles and we have essentially surrendered to this dark and twisted, ugly thing that they're trying to force down our throats against our will. We just can't do that. So, the graduates of Pavlov School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media didn't care much to cover the rise of this alt-right movement, as I mentioned here, plays into their agenda. For decades, the left have attempted to label the right as fascists or Nazis. They saw this as a way to cause people to rawly emote, to shut down their mental capacities and faculties, and to move to silence the opposition to the left. Again, that's straight out of Rules for Radicals by that deviant Saul Alinsky. And they are masters at this. They let it play to their favor, and they utilize timing to their favor as well, because they don't care what the ultimate outcome is other than promoting their left-wing agenda. And Cloward and Piven proves that they will do it to the great harm and detriment to society as a whole, because they don't care about us individually. They just care about their ideology. They just care about their political bent come hell or high water. And of course, that's dangerous. There is no other way to describe that other than as dangerous, as working against the time-honored traditions, values, and institutions of this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. And so they will find strange bedfellows with people like the so-called alt-right, because they see them as a tool or mechanism to be used to implement their tactics and strategies, to essentially go forth and force their ideology down our throats. But we can't accept that. We can't allow that to come to fruition, because it doesn't work. It is not rooted in the things that we hold near and dear. And therefore, if we are ever to overcome it and to place this nation back onto the path to prosperity, we have to reject these attempts to redefine us. And so, again, going back to what the alt-right has done, they have essentially removed the ability of the right in America to battle off this erroneous claim that the vast majority of us are racist, or that we are just for implementing the same type of identity politics that the left does, and to also demonstrate that fascism has its origins in socialism. After all, Benito Mussolini had been a socialist during World War I. and fascism sought the same sort of governmental control and command economy that one finds in the most aggressive forms of socialism, and which is always the end goal of any facet of socialism. And then on top of all of that, Nazi was short for the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Now, however, due to the GOP's failure to adequately resist Obama, the conservative movement is threatened by these movements, which were traditionally on the left, attempting to claim a prominent position on the right. That's where we are. That is what it has led us to. Some unacceptable, untenable situation. Now, there's something else that needs to be addressed with the alt-right, something which has been a major problem with the Republican Party. The alt-right is predominantly young. I know that I mentioned this earlier, but I'm going to really expound upon it here. You know, one of the reasons I dreamed up Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, back in my sophomore year of college was because I thought younger conservatives lacked a voice. The détente wing, which traced its halcyon days back to Richard Milhouse Nixon, did not want to give the young a voice. They wanted to cling on to power and not allow us to have any say over our own futures and our own destinies. Because the young were feeling slighted, they looked for an avenue through which to express themselves. Now, I myself wanted the young to have a voice in the conservative movement as well. However, I remained loyal to the Constitution. These alt-right people, not having this basis in our Constitution, this fluent working knowledge and understanding of our shared Constitution and thereby our fundamental and inalienable God-given rights, don't understand what it was. And so therefore they intrinsically, naturally, characteristically come forth with an overt hostility towards it because they think it's impotent. They think it doesn't work. And so they want to turn to these robust ideologies that were anti-representational government back in the 30s. And it has this shiny new veneer, the way they try and paint it, the way that Yiannopoulos and Bokhari try and make it seem as well. You notice they didn't really delve into, in that article, the names, or, you know, other than the names, the philosophies of the foundation of alt-right. I had to dig into that to find it, and I did. And again, it's something that we should be cautious about. It's something that we should not just allow ourselves to be interjected with. No, we have to go back to basics. Again, the heart of who we are as a nation and as a people. And to do that, we must be proactive. We must be vigilant. We must be unwilling and to allow them to redefine us, and unrelenting in our defense of all that we hold near and dear in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. And it's not an easy task. It's not an easy place to find ourselves, because we do have to overcome these problems. And with the young being attracted to this, they feel that they have no other way to take their legitimate grievances with modern society and have them addressed other than to attribute it to our representative Republican form of government and our shared Constitution, because ultimately they think it's wrong. They think it's wicked. They think that the system has systemically placed them in this position, and that's exactly what the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists want them to think. It causes that sort of chaos that promotes their twisted ideology, that pushes us in this untenable direction, this unsustainable direction, and they're gleeful when they have the opportunity to foist that upon us, when they have that opportunity to drastically and fundamentally redefine us. But no, we won't accept that, because that's not who we are, either as a nation or as a people. We're still with this lack of a decent understanding of American history and constitutional law, they are unaware that our founding fathers sought to escape the centralized philosophies of Europe and found a republic based on the notion that the people are the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty. Yet the détente wing of the gutless opposition party cannot be solely held to blame for the rise of this bizarre neo-counterculture. The alt-right is a symptom of the greater disease of political correctness and moral relativism, as these twin cancerous doctrines have been championed by the historical revisionists who dominate American academia. It means that these young, downtrodden, and bitter souls bought into the mantra that the Constitution is an archaic, impotent document that can't possibly apply to the modern era. That's what they believe. That's what they keep foisting upon us. That's what they want us to accept as the truth, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. And so, if we are to overcome this, we have to get back to basics. We have to go back to the Constitution. We have to spread the knowledge of the Constitution, because it is being suppressed by the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists. They are giddy about this. They are truly giddy about this, as they see it as an opportunity to double down on their efforts to redefine this nation, to spread the type of chaos that is an intrinsic part of their draconian ideology. And so, what we see is they believe that equal protection under the law and our fundamental and inalienable rights, as well as the natural law, are based on fantasies. They think it doesn't work. Going back to the neo-reactionaries, they try to be robotic about it. But this is about the human condition. This is about humanity. It's socialism and fascism and all of these other isms that engage in dehumanization and could literally put us in a dark place that we do not want to go. But Breitbart didn't care about that. The frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists don't care about that. To them, it's all about their agenda. It's all about their twisted machinations and ideologies that are lacking in principle, that are diametrically opposed to all that we value in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. And if we allow that to go to fruition, if we allow that to continue, they will spread chaos and anarchy, and there will be no way to stop them. And so what we also see here is, because they believe it's based on a fantasy, that sounds very similar to a school of jurisprudence or legal philosophy known as legal realism. And if it does sound familiar, or as though they are interrelated, it's because they are. So what is legal realism again? In other words, they believe that the law should adapt to society, and that the representative republic we have is an inefficient way to accomplish this, and that certain groups are just so inferior that they don't have rights. Again, that's the same strain and common thread of thought that we saw with the philosophical underpinnings of the so-called alt-right, even by Breitbart media, or Trump-Bart, which has championed the alt-rights. They're the ones that mention the names, but rather intellectually disingenuously refuse to elaborate onto what that ideology was. And sure, they hinted at white culture, but they didn't talk about inferior and superior cultures. Now, moral relativism would say that there is no inferior or superior culture. There is a superior culture. It is the American culture, as defined in the clear and concise language of our shared United States Constitution. But again, that's not the way that the alt-right views it. That's not the way that these disparate groups view it. And therefore, their twisted machinations are not well-founded. They're not rooted in the philosophy of these United States of America, and it can easily be abused in such a way as to draw the American people into a conflict with certain groups of them. And one of the areas where we see this, unfortunately, is something from Leon Wolf at Red State. He uncovered this destructive thing written by Tom Tancredo, in which Tancredo lashes out at Mormons. He went out to proclaim that the Mormon Church openly advocates for leaving our borders porous and to grant amnesty. It seems far-fetched and can be attributed to other churches too. Some high-ranking Catholics are for open borders and abortion, but that doesn't mean the faith is that way. But that's not how Tancredo put it. It's fear-mongering at its worst, folks. It's fear-mongering. And what Tancredo was trying to do was sit there and say that, well, it's not about religious liberty. It's about essentially their lies. So what does he mean by that? What is he getting at by that? What is he trying to make us conclude with it? That we should just attribute that to Mormons? Is it because of Glenn Beck? I've sure seen a lot of that in the alt-right circles. But that doesn't mean it's right. That doesn't mean that it's applicable or that it makes sense or that it's something that we should accept. It just means that that is one of these dark avenues that the alt-right philosophy goes down. And so again, we have to be cognizant of it. We have to be aware of it so that we can ensure that this poison doesn't harm society. Because if they had their way, it would. Clearly, if they had their way, it would. And so he attempted to tap dance around it, claiming it had nothing to do with freedom of religion. But that's the same thing the alt-right, which has been championed by Bannon, who was the leader of Breitbart, now part of the Trump campaign, is openly hostile to. That being freedom of religion. They embrace tribalism, which isn't necessarily a bad thing per se, but can be bad when it engages in scapegoating on a national level. Remember, George Washington warned against dividing into disparate, competing factions for this very reason. We could easily lose our sacred traditions and institutions from an enraged group of young, disillusioned souls who, not entirely incorrect in thinking this way, believe that they have no voice in American society. And that is partially the fault of the graduates of Pavlov, or, well, not the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media. It is their fault, but it's partially the fault of the detente wing of the gutless opposition party of GOP, the ones that have been sitting on their hands, refusing to allow the youth to have a voice. Well, we can't accept that. That's not who we are. Again, none of this ties directly or inherently to who we are as a nation and as a people. So to overcome it, to truly overcome it, we must stand shoulder to shoulder in solidarity and unity, and spread the tools that foster that fluent and working knowledge and understanding of our shared United States Constitution, and thereby our fundamental and inalienable God-given rights. That no government is legitimate when it attempts to encroach upon, abridge, belittle, besmirch, steal, destroy those sacred rights. Because that's what our duty, our obligation, and above all, our responsibility is in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty. And yes, I fully understand why the youth feels so disenfranchised and alienated by the status quo of the American system of polity. And therefore, what I say to these young people and encourage them to do is pick up a copy of your Constitution and of the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. You can find them online for free. Go to archive.org and look up Readings in American Constitutional History from 1776 to 1876 by Alan Johnson. These sources will help expose you to the true constitutional history of the United States and provides you with the best avenue to develop a voice and to be heard within our system of polity. If you want a brighter future, it must inexorably be linked to the preservation and promotion of our Constitution and thereby your fundamental and inalienable God-given rights. There's no other way around that. That is what you have to do if you wish to be free. And isn't that the natural state of humanity? To strive and to desire to be free? I think so. And that's why we do these shows for you folks, to empower you. Now, with that said, it's time for us to begin our descent. I'm going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back with one last round of alcohol. I promise you that she won't try and redefine alcohol. She's just there to pour it for you. As always, folks, I'm your captain, Randy Wright, and I want to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. I invite you to leave any questions, comments, or concerns you may have here at our YouTube page or our Facebook page. And on top of that, I invite you to follow us at Twitter with the Twitter handle at Radio Aviation EX. One more time, folks, that's at Radio Aviation EX. And there you'll find the departure board that lists my personal Twitter account, the personal Twitter account of my first officer, Jeremy Grapington, our Blogspot account, which has audio blogs, and it's just chock full of useful information, and our Cafe Press account that has all sorts of trinkets, goodies, and clothing, apparel, attire, tote bags, laptop bags, phone covers and protectors, what have you. It's all there with our traditional logo on it or our first-class passenger logo on it at reasonable prices. Go ahead and take a look at that. You're sure to find something that'll meet your needs and give us a little bit of support and support yourself. As always, thank you again for flying with us. We will see you again next time. Do take care.